Only experts notice these differences, the tiny details hiding in plain sight on every grocery store shelf, in every bottle of oil, every loaf of bread, every bag of cereal, and every plastic water bottle you've ever grabbed on a hot day without thinking twice. Because most of us were trained our whole lives to trust the packaging, to trust the bright green leaf on the label, to trust the word natural stamped across the front like it means something regulated and guaranteed, when in reality the food industry has spent decades learning exactly how far it can stretch a claim before it becomes a lie. And today we're going to walk through some of the most common products in your kitchen right now and talk about what the people who actually study this stuff for a living notice that you and I usually miss. Start with bread. Something so ordinary nobody questions it. Yet the difference between a loaf that costs $2 and one that costs $6 often comes down to a handful of dough conditioners and preservatives designed to keep the bread soft and shelf stable for weeks instead of days. Ingredients with long chemical names that most shoppers scroll past without a second thought. And while regulatory agencies consider these ingredients approved for use, nutritionists who specialize in food additives will tell you that a growing body of research is looking more closely at how some of these compounds interact with digestion and gut bacteria over the long term, which is why the people who know food best tend to check the ingredient list before the nutrition label, because the nutrition label tells you what's there, but the ingredient list tells you why it's there. Then there's the cereal aisle, marketed almost entirely at children with cartoon mascots and bright colors, where a single serving of what looks like a reasonable breakfast can contain close to half of the recommended daily sugar intake for a child. And here's the part that actually catches experts off guard. The serving sizes printed on the box are often smaller than what people actually pour into their bowl, which means the real sugar content of your average breakfast is usually higher than what's advertised, not because anyone is technically lying, but because the math is built around a portion nobody actually eats. Moving into the pantry, olive oil might be the single most misunderstood product in your kitchen because the words extra virgin on a label are supposed to mean something very specific, a certain acidity level, a certain extraction process, cold pressed without heat or chemicals. But independent testing conducted by researchers and universities over the years has repeatedly found that a significant percentage of oils sold as extra virgin on store shelves fail to meet that standard once they're actually tested in a lab. Sometimes because they're diluted with cheaper refined oils. Sometimes because they're just old and oxidized by the time they reach your cart. And the way trained tasters catch this is by smell and mouthfeel. A real extra virgin oil should have a peppery bite at the back of your throat and a grassy, slightly bitter aroma, while a fake or degraded one often smells flat, greasy, or like nothing at all, which sounds subtle until you taste the two side by side and realize you've probably never actually had the real thing. Cooking oils in general have quietly become one of the more debated topics in nutrition science because for years, many of the most common seed oils lining supermarket shelves were marketed as heart healthy simply because they're low in saturated fat. But some physicians and researchers have started raising concerns about how these oils are processed, the high heat extraction methods, the chemical solvents sometimes used to pull oil from the seed, and the way these oils behave when they're repeatedly heated, especially in restaurant fryers where the same oil might be used for days before it's replaced, producing compounds that some studies suggest may contribute to inflammation, which is why you'll notice more doctors these days quietly steering their own kitchens back toward oils that have been used for centuries with far less processing involved. Bottled water might seem like the simplest product on this entire list, just water in a bottle. What could possibly be hiding there? But this is exactly the category where the gap between marketing and reality tends to be the widest. Because a notable portion of bottled water sold in stores is technically sourced from the same municipal systems that supply ordinary tap water, filtered and repackaged and sold at a markup that can be hundreds of times the cost of what comes out of your faucet. And then there's the plastic itself. With independent testing organizations finding measurable levels of microplastic particles in many popular bottled water brands, a finding that has pushed some scientists to recommend filtered tap water in a reusable container as the more transparent option, not necessarily because bottled water is dangerous, but because the story printed on the label, the mountain spring, the pristine glacier, rarely matches where the water actually came from. Fast food supply chains operate on a scale that's genuinely hard to picture, with a small number of massive processing facilities supplying the exact same core ingredients to thousands of locations across an entire country, which is part of how these companies achieve that eerie consistency, where a burger in one city tastes identical to a burger 1,000 miles away. And the people who've worked inside these supply chains describe a level of engineering most customers never think about. Ingredients formulated specifically to survive freezing, shipping, and reheating without losing texture. Flavor compounds added back in after processing strips the natural ones out. And portion size is calculated down to the gram to control cost. All of it invisible to the person standing at the counter who just sees a menu board and a smiling employee. Organic labeling is another area where good intentions on the part of consumers collide with a system that's more complicated than the average shopper realizes, because organic certification regulates how a crop is grown and what can legally be used on it. Things like synthetic pesticides and genetically modified seeds, but it doesn't automatically mean a product is healthier, more nutritious, or free of all processing. And food scientists often point out that a bag of organic potato chips is still, at the end of the day, a bag of fried potato chips. The organic label describing the farming method, not the nutritional outcome, which is a distinction that gets lost in marketing that leans heavily on words like natural and clean without those terms carrying any real regulated meaning at all. Grocery stores themselves are designed with a level of psychological intention that most shoppers never clock, from the placement of bread and milk at the far corners of the store, forcing you to walk past everything else to get there, to eye-level shelving reserved for the most profitable brands, while cheaper store brand alternatives sit lower down where you have to bend down and look for them, to the subtle use of lighting and music tempo to slow your pace and keep you in the store longer, all of it studied and refined over decades by people whose entire job is understanding exactly how far your attention span and willpower will stretch under fluorescent lighting after a long day. And finally, protein powders, an industry that exploded over the last decade, riding the wave of fitness culture, where independent lab testing has occasionally turned up products with significantly less actual protein than advertised on the label. A practice sometimes referred to as protein spiking, where cheaper amino acids are added to boost the nitrogen count that lab tests use to estimate protein content, effectively gaming the test without providing the real nutritional value the label promises, which is why people who actually work in sports nutrition tend to recommend looking past the marketing entirely and checking for third-party testing certifications, because in an industry with relatively loose regulation, the companies willing to pay for outside verification are usually the ones with nothing to hide. None of this means every product on the shelf is secretly harmful, or that you need to overhaul your entire pantry overnight, because plenty of these categories still contain genuinely solid options. The real skill experts bring to the table isn't fear, it's attention, the habit of flipping a package over before flipping it into the cart, of understanding that a label is written by a marketing department while an ingredient list is regulated by law, of knowing that words like natural, clean, and healthy carry almost no legal weight compared to words like certified, tested, and verified. And once you start noticing these small differences, the way a trained eye does, you start to realize the gap between what we're sold and what we're actually buying isn't hidden at all. It's sitting right there in plain text on the back of every package, waiting for someone to actually read it.